Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, everyone. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day and welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by American Jewish Committee. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. This past Friday, the Israel Defense Forces launched Operation Breaking Dawn in response to days of threats from the Iranian-backed Palestinian Islamic Jihad that it would attack Israel. Since then, over 1,000 rockets were fired towards Israel before a ceasefire was announced yesterday. Joining us today for an on-the-ground briefing is AJC Jerusalem Director Lt. Colonel Reserve Avital Leibovich in conversation with AJC Chief Policy and Political Affairs Officer Jason Isaacson. After we hear from Avital and Jason, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, that's questions plural, or you may use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Jason, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniel. Avital, thank you for conducting this Advocacy Anywhere briefing. By no means the first time that you've reported on and analyzed threats to Israel and Israel's response to those threats in real time, with rockets falling or having recently fallen, with the country and with yourself on high alert. We're eager to hear your assessment of the security situation as it stands now, as well as what led up to the Israeli Defense Forces Operation Breaking Dawn, which began on Friday, and the extent and the impact of the attacks launched by the Iranian-backed terror group Palestinian Islamic Jihad. I have other questions for you as well. But let's begin with the current state of play. Is the ceasefire that was announced yesterday still holding? And is this latest crisis over, at least for now?
So thank you, Jason, for this opportunity. The negotiations lasted the whole day yesterday until they reached a final agreement to a ceasefire. The ceasefire came into effect last night, my time in Israel, 11:30 p.m. However, I can tell you that there were two violations immediately after the ceasefire. The first one took place 8 minutes after the ceasefire, and the second one took 15 minutes after the ceasefire. Both of them had to do with rocket fire, but after that, it has been quiet ever since. I have to tell you that personally, I still have my shelter prepared. All the windows are locked because when the leader of the Islamic Jihad in Gaza says that, maybe there will be some circumstances in which the Islamic Jihad will choose when to fire again rockets to Israel, then this means that, we are in a temporary ceasefire. We still have to be alert here in Israel, but today was a quiet day, which is, of course, a positive thing.
Let's go back to last week. What did trigger the IDF operation on Friday? What was and what is now the nature of the threat posed to Israel by Palestinian Islamic Jihad? Also, how does Islamic Jihad differ from the terror group Hamas, which of course rules Gaza? That is there a difference?
A lot of big questions. I'll try to break them down and of course answer a complete answer. Bassam al-Asadi is a senior Islamic Jihad leader who was arrested by Israel on Friday. A senior Islamic Jihad official told Al Jazeera immediately following this arrest that his arrest is, quote, crossing the red lines, and that, quote, our military wing will respond to Israel's crimes. Basically, what we've seen here is the Palestinian Islamic Jihad try to connect two arenas. Obviously, Gaza, where they're located in, and the West Bank, where Israel arrested this terrorist Asadi. They wanted to say by this connection that they're responsible for both, they oversee both areas. Israel naturally would never comply with such an attempt. Asadi, this terrorist, 61 years old, has been behind bars in Israel for 15 years. In addition to his being an inspiration, a jihadist inspiration, I would say, to young Palestinians, I can tell you that his two sons died in clashes with the IDF in 2002. His wife was also arrested. And if you remember the recent attack, Jason, we had in Tel Aviv a couple of months ago, where the terrorists just went into the streets and sprayed fire to a few restaurants, and this terrorist is actually a family member of Assadi. So basically, we're talking about a well-connected family to other terror groups in Judea and Samaria, in the West Bank, and also in Gaza as well. So this brings us to the fact that the Palestinian Islamic Jihad actually planned some kind of a deadly terror attack against Israeli targets. The Israeli government, while not wanting to take any chances, actually shut down all the roads and gave very strict restrictions to the communities, to the civilians living in the communities on the outskirts of Gaza. And I'm talking about something like 30,000 Israelis that were under some sort of a lockdown for 4 days, 4 very long days. Now, the main source of income in that area is agriculture. So you can imagine that these people could not go to their fields to work. Many of them have different kinds of crops, which of course, obviously they lost. Some raise animals of different sorts. So this was quite a situation for these 30,000 people who live in that area. But what kind of really activity were they planning against an Israeli target? So according to the Israeli intelligence, we understand that the Palestinian Islamic Jihad wanted to use a precise missile called Cornet in order to target probably a bus of people, maybe a bus of soldiers, maybe a bus of workers in the area or anything of that sort. And that's why Israel decided, after these 4 days of a lockdown, Israel decided to preemptively strike the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and prevent this attack. By doing so, by the way, also restraining other terror organizations in Gaza. Of course, we have Hamas in Gaza, but we also have other terror organizations across the region, which were very, very focused on how Israel is acting, what kind of weapons is it using, and what kind of success rates does it have. So we're talking about a total of 55 hours of a military operation. In the course of this operation, Jason, I can tell you that more than 165 jihad sites, military outposts, launching pads, manufacturing warehouses for mortars were all targeted. But the most severe blow that the Palestinian Islamic Jihad received was actually the senior leadership of this organization was eliminated. And within the first few hours of this operation, you could see really a situation of unclarity and confusion. From their perspective, they really did not know how to run the operation on the ground, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad militants. They really were confused. You could see they really had no commander on the ground. And in addition to this, I can tell you that the Iron Dome batteries which were deployed all over the country, because of course there was also concern that rocket fire will hit remote areas like Jerusalem and like Tel Aviv and maybe even beyond Tel Aviv. So batteries of Iron Dome have been deployed throughout the country. It had an amazing success of 96%. We can talk about that later. From an Israeli perspective, I can tell you that from day one of the operation, Israel set the tone for the operation. It chose the timing, it chose what kind of operation we'll have, and it also chose last night the conditions to end the operation. We had, as I can see, a very good amount of international legitimacy for Israel's self-defense, and our image worldwide at the end of the day really was not harmed. As for the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, they really failed in this operation. For number one, they failed to position themselves as the leaders of the Palestinian resistance, because at the end of the day, they were left on their own. Hamas did not join the fun. Other organizations did not fire at Israel from Lebanon, for example, where we know there are other Palestinian organizations, so they were left alone. And this was a very clear message to them of maybe mistrust, maybe not receiving them as leaders. The second reason they failed is that they're an Iranian-backed organization, which means they get funding from Iran, they get directives from Iran. Actually, their leadership was in Tehran at the same time where the military operation took place. And, you know, we spoke here in Israel that while their military and leadership is in Tehran, enjoying coffee in restaurants and sleeping in 5-star hotels in Tehran, their commanders here on the ground are really not doing so well. So the fact that they are an Iranian proxy actually distanced them from many Arab countries, so they did not gain support from them. The third reason I want to claim that the Palestinian Islamic Jihad failed is that, you know, they gave a name to the operation from their perspective. And the name they chose was Uniting Fronts. And the implication of that was that they're uniting their just cause to fight in Gaza and the West Bank. In reality, they failed because the West Bank was quiet, East Jerusalem were quiet, the Arabs in Israel were quiet, and therefore they did not manage to do a unification of the fronts just like they aimed. And I would say the fourth reason for their failure was from an operational perspective. Look, they fired more than 1,000 rockets in 3 days, which only caused at the end minimal damage at the Israeli side. Now, 1,000 rockets is a very big number. It's a large number of rockets. Of course, I don't treat it in an easy way, but the damage was minimal. So they had nothing to show, nothing to present themselves as, you know, as leaders in the field of ammunition and military success. They really failed operationally. Moreover, more than 160 rockets, which they fired towards Israel, U-turned in the air because the rocket goes high and then flies to its target. But 160 rockets U-turned and went back to Gaza. By doing so, they killed innocent people in Gaza, they wounded others, they created damage. So I would say they were not really successful operationally as well. So these are the 4 reasons I believe the Islamic Jihad failed. You wanted to ask me about the difference between the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas. And it is a good question because there is major differences. There are major differences between the two. For one, Hamas is leading. It's the leader of Gaza, which means they have a load of responsibility, primarily civilian responsibility. They have to feed 2 million Palestinians on an area of 356 square kilometers. They have to provide services, welfare services, education services, medical services. For them, for Hamas, the humanitarian access is critical for their survival in Gaza. Before this operation took place, Israel made sure, for example, that every month, millions of shekels are going in the Gaza Strip. In return, Hamas promised quiet. So, of course, it was in Hamas's interest to make sure that the Islamic Jihad launched operation will be terminated as quickly as possible. Of course, I'll mention that there are 15,000 Gazans who work on a daily basis in Israel. So Hamas has here a lot to lose, a lot more than the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which are basically a loose cannon. They are challenging Hamas. They don't have any civilian responsibilities. They get their orders from Tehran, and basically they can decide when to fire, how far to fire, how many rockets to fire, and so on and so forth. Just on the arsenal part, I will just say that although Islamic Jihad is not a tiny organization, they have 10,000 soldiers, militants, and they have similar number of rockets. Hamas is a lot bigger and more experienced and more trained and more developed militarily, and they have other kind of qualities, operational qualities. So this is another difference between them. But as I said, the main difference between them is really the fact that Hamas has civilian responsibilities, which the Palestinian Islamic Jihad do not have whatsoever. Finally, I just want to go back for a second to the operation, because the biggest challenge that Israel has, and this meets us time and time again in every operation or war, not only in Gaza, but also in Lebanon. And I'm talking about the very densely populated areas which terror groups choose to place their weapons in, their caches, their storages, whether it's in hospitals or mosques or underground civilian houses. And by the way, where I can also share with you that the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, just like Hamas, has dozens of terror tunnels which are used to flee terrorists or to store rockets. And they are really located underneath civilian areas. So this is a huge challenge for Israel, which does whatever it can to prevent some kind of civilian casualties. And I want to share with you a clip shortly. It's a very short clip, and it has English subtitles. And in this clip, you will see two Israeli pilots talking between them. And this is something that goes on hundreds of times in any operation, anywhere in the region. The pilots actually are focused on a target which they received from the intelligence forces on the ground. They're speaking directly with each other from the air and the ground. And suddenly they see civilians very close to the target. So let's watch the clip and see what kind of decision the pilots receive.
קיבלת בן אדם בתוך ה-60 מטר מתקרב למבנה?
בן אדם ב-60 מטר איפה?
ממזרח לבית, על הציר, מתקרב למבנה, עוד 10 שניות יחלוף אותו.
אנחנו בחדר.
חדר קיבלנו.
So they saw the civilian, which is circled with a white circle, and they decided to abort the mission. The house, by the way, on the right, this was the target of this specific goal. This was a specific target that the pilots received from the intelligence. They decided to abort. And this is something that happens time and time again because of the very densely populated areas inside Gaza in this situation, but also elsewhere.
Thank you, Avital. Thank you for showing us that clip. By the way, in talking about Hamas, which stayed out of the fight this time, of course, there have been other times in the past when it has not stayed out of the fight, and it has very much endangered the civilian population it is ostensibly charged with protecting. But let me move on or back to the issue of the circumstances of the ceasefire that was just negotiated yesterday. There have been a number of violent exchanges between Gaza-based terror groups and Israel over the years since Israel's unilateral withdrawal from Gaza in 2005. Major exchanges have included Operation Cast Lead in 2008-2009, Operation Protective Edge in 2014, and of course, what occurred in May of 2021, the Hamas-Israel conflict. The latest confrontation with Islamic Jihad was significantly shorter than all of these. Establishment of a ceasefire, which in the past has really been a protracted process, was accomplished in a matter of hours, it seems, yesterday. What changed this time? Why was it possible to bring about a ceasefire so quickly?
You are 100% right. The operation this time lasted 55 hours. The reason why it ended after such a short time is really very simple. It's because Israel reached its goals. The first and the main goal was to thwart the immediate threat of those anti-tank strategic missiles, which Palestinian Islamic Jihad planned to do. So this was the primary goal. And the secondary goal was to target the senior commanders of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad in order to make sure that it takes a long while before they return to their military compatibility for the next time. So I would also say that this time the IDF, Israel, were focused primarily and only on the Palestinian Islamic Jihad targets. And as I mentioned before, Hamas is in charge of civilian life. So for instance, infrastructure, roads, bridges, clinics, different service centers, different operations, the previous operations which you mentioned, Israel targeted those infrastructure buildings. Since we're talking about an organization that has no relevance and no connection to infrastructure, of course, the targets were very surgical and very accurate. I would also like to say that there were also very low numbers of civilians who were uninvolved, who were killed. Although we did see human shield phenomenon return over and over again, I'll just explain to our viewers that the human shield is a situation in which a terrorist understands or hears maybe above him some sort of a drone and understands that he's under surveillance. So the easiest thing to do is to grab a child in the arms and walk with that child, understanding and realizing that Israel will not target someone with a civilian next to him or a child which he's holding. So this is something that we did see here, and it is similar to Hamas tactics. Just to demonstrate to the resolution that Israel goes to in order to prevent the deaths of civilians, I would like to share with you another very, very short clip. And in this clip, this is a conversation between a Secret Services officer who is speaking to a Palestinian in Gaza. The target here was a 4-floor high building, which was used for storing rockets. And I don't know any other countries who calls a resident of the building to ensure that all other people left the building so that, you know, it could be targeted. And so let's hear the conversation. It's in Arabic. Of course, you have the subtitles in English. There are many, many calls like this in every operation.
ابو حفيره اسمع اخويا الله يرضى عليك تركز معي صلى على رسول الله. ماشي شوف احنا انتوا عارفين اخويا احنا كيف نتصرف ماشي. انا ما ودي انضر اي حد. بقول لك انا شايف الناس بيرجعوا البيوت العمارات وبيطلعوا. الحين خليك معي. انا العماره تبع خليفه فاضيه؟ هلقيت ما فيش حد. ماشي هلقيت ما فيش حد اكيد. انت متاكد شفت بعيونك؟ شايف بعيني مفيش ولا حد في الشارع. ماشي البيوت اللي موجودين وراء البيت وين النخلات فاضيه؟ كلهم. طب من الاربعه انفار اللي انا شفته طلعوا من دقائق من 4 دقائق. هذول قلنا لهم اطلعوا لانه بدهم يضربوا الدار اللي ورا فراحوا طلعوهم. كانوا خايفين وين يروحوا فطلعوهم طلعوا. ماشي الحين اسمع كل العمارات والبيوت حوالي بيت خليفه فاضي مظبوط؟ اسمع ايش بيصير كمان 4 دقائق ماشي. كمان شويه انا بضرب ايش؟ بضرب الصاروخ الانذار ماشي. انا ودي الناس ما يكونوا واقفين على المفرق.
So I don't know really other armies who actually give the information in advance of a target that they will be attacking. I don't know any army else in other army in the world, other country in the world who uses this kinds of tactics in order to make sure there are no civilians involved. And in the conversation, you heard how many times the officer repeated the same question. Are there any residents in the building? 3 or 4 times, just to make sure. And even after he received the answer, he spoke about warning ammunition. Warning ammunition is something that only makes noise on the roof of the building, which basically is an indication if there are any people inside that, this building is marked in a way. So really, this is a huge challenge, and I wanted to share with you because this is something that has been part of our lives here many, many times in every operation.
But by the way, not just the building itself, but the immediate neighborhood of the building he was asking about, making sure the market was cleared out and everything else. No, thank you for sharing that, Avital. You were talking about the top commanders of Palestinian Islamic Jihad who were taken out at the beginning of this operation. What is the expected impact on the group going forward when you have commanders taken off the battlefield like this? I'm also remembering many years ago the killing of Sheikh Yassin, the founder and spiritual leader of Hamas, who was killed in 2004. Hamas is still there, still posing a threat. What's the long-term effect, you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. The operation began with the killing of Taysir Jabari. Taysir Jabari is a very senior commander. You can also see by the ages that these are people who have been around for dozens of years, which means they have a lot of experience, a lot of expertise. They know the area, they know the ground, they know the tactics, they know the Israeli military. So this expertise, of course, is something that cannot be, traded with a young commander who will, step in and be the substitute of Jabari. After 2 days, there was another commander who was actually equivalent to Jabari. Jabari was in the north part of Gaza. They have like 2 brigades, one in the north and the other commander was in the south. So basically, these are the most senior commanders on the ground. And while they were eliminated, we saw how the Palestinian Islamic Jihad system went into a shock. They did not find their arms and legs. There was no leader who could, tell the forces where to go or what exactly to do. It seems like all the original plans they made were really distorted. And there is no question about it. In Israel, the assessment is that this is really a harsh blow to their operational capabilities, to their military capabilities. And therefore, I think we'll see this major impact on them in the next couple of months, which means really it will take them a long time to reach the same level of operational readiness than they had before the operation began.
Let me go in a different direction, Avital. You were speaking at the very beginning of this conversation about the reaction to this operation in the Arab world, including parts of the Arab world that now have a normal diplomatic relationship with Israel. AJC, of course, closely followed the international reaction to developments over the weekend, and we were active on social media explaining the threat that Israel faced and continues to face from terror groups linked to Iran, including, of course, the ongoing threat from Hezbollah. It was reassuring, if not surprising, to hear a message of real solidarity from Washington, from President Biden himself. We just tweeted about that. But it was also interesting to see a range of opinion expressed in the Arab world, from the United Arab Emirates, which appealed for calm and the reduction of escalation, to the reaction of Qatar, for instance, which called for, quote, the international community to move urgently to stop the Israeli occupation's repeated attacks against civilians, especially women and children. Were you surprised by any of the reactions that you've seen?
Well, actually, I was not surprised by the extent of the, I would say, international legitimacy level, which Israel received. When I look at the issue of international legitimacy, obviously, this is something which is built over time. And also, this includes a few layers. One layer is bilateral relations, and you rightly mentioned the Abraham Accords, and which AJC helped promote, and of course the relations that we have built here in Israel with those Arab countries for the past 2 years, and the numerous MOUs, different agreements that we have signed to them, from tourism to medicine to R&D to just academic cooperation and others. So bilateral relations is an important, fundamental, basic when we talk about building relations. There's another factor to legitimacy in the world, and that is the personal relations between leaders. I think President Biden was recently in Israel, and you know, you couldn't help but see the great affection that he has towards Israel, the Israeli leaders, the Israeli people. So the personal relations, I believe, also have a role to play here. And finally, there was the layer of the media, which is the more public, I would say, layer. From an international perspective, the world was very busy with other issues for the last couple of days when the operation took place. For once, there was the war in Ukraine that got attention, maybe more in Europe, but still got a lot of attention. There was the China-Taiwan kind of tensions. Even in the US, I followed, you know, the president's tweets, and I saw a lot of tweets dealt with internal issues, primarily economic issues. So I'm thinking that the average American does not really care about the siege in Gaza, but more about, you know, the price of the gas. So the attention of the media, which at the end of the day is the tool which allocates the information to the public, to the world, was not in Israel, was not in Gaza. I can tell you that generally speaking, the interest of the world in Israel in terms of media focus has really went down in the last couple of years. I remember that only something like 10 years ago, CNN in Jerusalem, for example, had 3 filming crews, and each of the filming crew had a story every day. Today, you can maybe hear a story from CNN in the Jerusalem office on the website, maybe on a good week. So the level of attention is definitely different. Again, I think that the fact that this is an Iranian-backed organization also had an impact on the Arab world. And many Arab countries who fear Iran, who don't agree with Iran's very extreme and violent direction, choose not to express public support for a terror group which is identifying with Iran. So I would say the combination of this actually provided Israel a very good international blanket of legitimacy. I can say one thing, though. I read very carefully, you know, the UN has a special envoy to the Middle East, and a Norwegian diplomat by the name of Tor. And I read his statement, official statement, very carefully. And to my great surprise, Jason, he never mentioned one rocket of the 1,000 rockets that were fired to Israel. And it was very focused on the Palestinians and not mentioning Israel suffering at all, which was quite illegitimate. So to summarize this point, I think Israel enjoyed 55 hours of almost, you know, side-to-side international legitimacy.
Indeed. And I think even some statements by the United Kingdom, by the European Union, by some others.
Germany.
Yeah, Germany. Even if they weren't as full-throated in their defense of Israel, recognized that Israel had a right to defend itself,
Right.
And they called for calm, which wasn't surprising or out of place. Let's go back to what you were saying earlier about Israel's ability to defend itself. You talked about the Iron Dome's 96% effectiveness, which is phenomenal, although maybe not unprecedented. The Iron Dome is amazing. Talk about, in general, Israel's defensive systems, including, I know when President Biden was there 3 weeks ago, he visited an Iron Dome, or he got a briefing on Iron Dome, but also on the latest laser-based system, Iron Beam. Talk about how that is developing.
Yeah, so if I would have to nominate, the king of the operation, that would probably be the Iron Dome. This is a system that actually saves lives. There is no other way to look at it. It's a system which is developed and manufactured by Rafael, which is a government-owned security industry. The system has been operational for 10 years already, but it had a lot of improvements over the years. So let me give you some interesting numbers. And in one of your previous questions, Jason, you asked me about the previous encounters in Gaza. So in 2012, when we had the operation in Gaza and the Iron Dome batteries were used for the first time, they still had a very high success rate. That was 84%. In 2014, the Iron Dome batteries already had 90% success rate. In 2019, 92% success rate, as well as in 2021, and this year, this operation, 96%. So the higher the percentages, of course, the more precise the system. And I can tell you that it really gives a relief to Israelis who live here. And although I wasn't targeted, my city wasn't targeted, can tell you that the atmosphere in which you step outside just to hang your laundry and you hear the explosion sounds of the interception, and you know that it's successful noise, that the noise is a good noise because it means that the system was able to intercept a rocket. So yes, this is an amazing system that allows us somewhat to continue our daily lives. 18 and 19-year-olds are operating the system. It takes a little bit more than a second to really decide whether to press the button or not. The system has an efficiency and it can detect whether a rocket fired from Gaza will fall in an open area or not. And I have to mention the very strong strategic partnership with the US that part of the security aid is being used to manufacture the Iron Dome interceptors, which is again critical and saving lives. The second system that you actually spoke about, it sounds like, I'm sure for our viewers, it sounds like something from Star Wars movie. And it is a little bit like that. We're talking about an Iron Beam. This is the first of its kind system in the world. All Israeli developed, again in Rafael. Basically, it's based on a concept where several laser beams are being combined together to intercept short-range rockets. When I say short-range rockets, I mean a rocket that could fly into 50 to 70 kilometers. So I'm not talking about 1 kilometer, but a little bit longer. The system is not operational yet. The expectation is that it will take maybe a year before it becomes operational. But a laser doesn't cost the same amount of money that an interceptor, high technological developed rocket costs. So this will be a lot cheaper. And also in terms of HR, it will be of course, better. So we're talking about a complementary system, which will make our lives, I think, more easy in the future. And again, I think Israel here is showing to the world its creative and startup mind-like capabilities. Unfortunately, it's in the field of security and defense, but nevertheless, I think this will really upgrade our defensive system.
Well, Israel shows its startup and innovative abilities in so many other fields too. It's not just in defense. Avital, thank you. I think at this point, I've got more questions, but I'd like to see if, I know that there are a number of questions that are coming in from our audience. So Daniel, let's turn it to our viewers.
Thank you, Jason. Our first question comes from Don Barkuzin. What is stopping the PIJ from pairing up with another Iranian proxy in the north, such as Hezbollah, and which border poses the greatest threat to Israel, Gaza or the Syria and Lebanon border?
Wow, great question. No, nothing is stopping. Nothing is stopping from the PIJ of teaming up with the Hezbollah or another organization. The only thing really that stopped it this time was orders from Tehran. That's it. There's implications when you are being funded by Iran and your orders are in Tehran. There are implications to that. And these were the orders that PIJ received, and this is what they complied with. In terms of threats, then of course there is no comparison whatsoever between two terror groups in Gaza, they have an impact, of course, but they're not the same extent as Hezbollah, who was established at the late 70s with a huge arsenal of 150,000 rockets. Many thousands of them can cover the entire country, plus a presence on Syrian ground as well. Of course, high-level training, a lot of experience and expertise, Iranian escort holding hands on a daily basis. So this is a whole different kind of threat for Israel. And this is part of what Israel is doing on a daily basis. The Israeli military is required to prepare for any kind of military escalation on the border with Syria and Lebanon. By the way, although these are separate countries, the military establishment in Israel treats this as one front because of Hezbollah's very strong dominance in those two countries. I hope we won't end in another war in Lebanon. The last war was in 2006. Following the kidnapping of a few Israeli soldiers. So I hope we will not be there. But again, just like the Islamic Jihad, here too, Hezbollah is receiving its orders from Tehran. So, this is at the end of the day what will count, whether we'll be heading to another escalation or not.
Thank you, Avital. Daniel?
Yes, our next question comes from Norman Shane. Avital, how is the Israeli military functioning now with respect to the rather uncertain status of the Israeli government? And perhaps how will that impact the threat from Iranian nuclear development? And on this topic too, Eduardo Wertzman is asking, what effects, if any, do you believe this operation will have in the elections?
Okay, so as for the second question, zero effect on the elections. The elections are 2.5 months from now. That's a very long time. By next week, I think this operation will be forgotten by most of the Israelis, except those who lived near Gaza. So zero impact on the potential of the politicians to succeed in the elections. As for the first part of the question, can you repeat it just for a second, Daniel?
Sure. The first part is, how is the Israeli military functioning now with respect to the uncertainty?
Perfect. So I think this part actually is something which I am proud of as an Israeli, because there is really no effect I would say there is no combination of the political echelon and the military echelon. So these are two separate echelons. The politicians are deciding on the policy, and the military needs to conduct or fulfill that policy. The military has been training for different kinds of scenarios. Gaza is one of them. Targets are a basic thing. I mean, the finding targets is something basic that the military does in all arenas where there are terror threats for Israel. So there's not really an impact on the current political situation. The chief of staff, the Israeli chief of staff, gave his recommendations to the Minister of Defense, who is very experienced because he himself used to be the chief of staff, and he's not a new minister. So he knows the work, he understands the arena, and then he approved the operational plan. Most of the parties, I would say, were joining in solidarity with the Israeli Defense Forces and this operation, except the Joint Arab List Party, which not only stands out in its criticism to the operation specifically, but also try to damage Israel in the public arena, publishing its its Knesset members try to publish different kinds of falsehoods along the operation. But except that party, and again, we have a system of something like 14 parties right now. The vast majority of the politicians were standing in solidarity. I can summarize and say that for 55 hours, the politicians stood together with no divisions.
Thank you, Avital. Daniel?
Sure. We have a couple questions from Howard Soloway, Doval Mug, and others that are asking that how did the rockets enter Gaza in the first place? What routes are they being taken? And how does Iran get large sums of money and weapons into Gaza, given the blockades, and several questions along those lines.
Yeah. Okay. So the history of the rockets of Gaza. The first rocket was fired from Gaza to Israel in 2001. So we are celebrating 20 years of rocket fire into Gaza, from Gaza into Israel. Those rockets in 2001 actually were homemade. Most of them were homemade, which basically meant that the terror groups in Gaza at the time took different materials, sugar, powders, fertilizers of different kinds, mixed them together, created some sort of a rocket, explosive powder from that, and then some sort of a rocket. These rockets had a very short shelf life, something like between 4 and 5 days, which means that the terror groups which prepared these rockets had to use them quite quickly, quite immediately. The range of these rockets was quite short, I would say, something like 20,000 people at 2001. But as the years passed, the system of the rocket production improved, and a few things helped to this production. Number one, the tunnels. Hamas and Islamic Jihad dug tunnels on the border with Egypt. As you know, Gaza has 2 borders. On the one side, Egypt, on the other side, Israel. They dug more than 1,000 tunnels between Egypt and Gaza. And through these tunnels, anything you can imagine came through. What we were interested and concerned with were the different kinds of weapons, ammunitions, rockets that came in. By the way, Chinese rockets were some of the rockets that came in. And eventually, those tunnels also served as smuggling specialists and experts who knew how to produce proper rockets. So pretty soon, factories for rockets and for drones were beginning to be built inside the Gaza Strip. And those days of homemade rockets were gone very quickly. And therefore, within the scope of 20 years, we are seeing that the range of the rockets increased from 4 kilometers to 120 kilometers, from a range of 20,000 people to a range of 4 million people. And as for the funding, when you have Iranian money, it's not really a problem. And this is how they reached to the point where they are. At the end of the day, there are 2 directions in Gaza where you can fire a rocket. One direction is to the Mediterranean Sea, and the other direction is to Israel. There are no 3rd and 4th options. And they have been training firing towards the Mediterranean Sea and then triggering Israel with rocket firing for, as I said, over 2 decades. So that's where we are today. No issue of funding, no limits on the capacity of production. And the latest actor in this weapons arena is the drone. The drone is an asset for any terror group, of course, for Hamas and Islamic Jihad as well. Drones can carry explosives from different amount of explosives. Of course, they can also be served for surveillance purposes. And this is, again, something they have been manufacturing in Gaza with a big help of Iran.
And I guess was it Hamas that was using, was it kites and balloons back a few years ago? Is that Are those
Yes,
vehicles?
you're referring to incendiary balloons,
Indeed.
which were flown over the border fence between Gaza and Israel. It's an issue of seconds. And as you know, Israel is a very hot country and windy sometimes in the summer, those areas specifically. So they basically set tens of thousands of dunams of crops on fire. And this is a very low-tech system, which Israel struggled to deal with, to handle. But I think they haven't used it actually in the last 2 years or so. So I think we may have solved this until the next challenge pops up.
And I think Israel has also taken very significant steps to solve the problem of tunnels under the border with Israel.
That's correct. I think for the first time in this operation, we saw an operational system, which again does not exist anywhere else in the world. Again, an Israeli development, which took quite a long time and was very expensive to produce. And I'm talking about a system that has sensors underground. Basically, imagine a wall with sensors that is built underground. And those sensors are indicators whether tunnels are being dug. And of course, I'm talking about tunnels which are being dug from the Gazan side, crossing to the Israeli side. Because one of the challenges that we face in Israel is the issue of abduction. And those tunnels that in the past have been dug by Hamas and by others, their operational goal was to send a commando unit and a Hamas or Islamic Jihad commando unit to the Israeli side of the border, inside a village, and try to kidnap as many people as possible in order to then either kill them or negotiate for them, or both really. I'm happy to say that since the system was operational, there are no tunnels right now crossing into Israel, according to the Israeli intelligence. There are many tunnels still in Gaza, but they're not crossing the border. In Gaza, they're being used to store rockets and to hide terror operatives.
Indeed. Avital, thank you. Daniel, other questions?
Yes, our next question comes from Mike on Zoom. What specific role did U.S. administration diplomats play, if any, in achieving the ceasefire? Has the U.S. administration pledged to resupply Iron Dome missiles expended in the defense of Israel, citizens, and cities from 1,000 plus jihad terror missiles?
So I have to say that in this specific operation, since it was relatively short, there was no need for the U.S. to intervene in terms of interceptors. But I do remember a situation in 2014. We had another operation in Gaza, and the operation was very long. And 10 days after the operation began, Israel needed a very quick lifeline of $258 million from Congress to produce interceptors. And AJC was actually a part of I think a main part by pressuring and trying to help Israel with Congress here, and was very successful. I can tell you that within 8 hours, those interceptors funding was granted. And again, for us as Israelis, this is a critical lifeline because it really saves our lives. And there's no other way of describing it. It's really a top-notch defensive tool. I can also say about this operation that I think the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Tom Knights, I think was one of the first foreign diplomats to really speak out and understand and sympathize with Israel's right to defend itself. And he really said that the U.S. stands by Israel. So that was quite significant. The player here that negotiated was actually Egypt. We don't talk a lot about Egypt, but Egypt is a key actor in the region. It's a huge country, 105 million people, joint border with Israel, many mutual interests with Israel. As in this case, Israel doesn't, Egypt is not interested in terrorists roaming its deserts, the Sinai area. It needs quiet on the border rather than, a terror group which is building up its military capabilities. So Egypt here played an important role. And I was proud to see that for the first time, the Israeli government in its official public statement even thanked Egypt, primarily its president, President Al-Sisi, for being a part of this critical solution.
So let me pick up on this. I also read that in the negotiations that Egypt conducted with Qatar as well, supposedly assisting them with Palestinian Islamic Jihad, that they made a commitment of some sort to try to press Israel to release 2 Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists. Is there any chance that these PIG terrorists will be released? And if not, are there any implications?
So here we go into the culture differences. So there are public statements, which you mentioned, of course, and there's the reality. At the end of the day, Israel will not release terrorists which have blood on their hands from an Israeli perspective. There are terrorists who are responsible for the deaths of Israelis. So this will not happen. And I'll show you the gap between what you read, the public statement, and the reality which will be on the ground. The reality will be that Egypt will be provided information on their medical and health status of these 2 prisoners. And Egypt will convey this information to the Islamic Jihad. So there's a big difference between the public statement and the reality on the ground. Of course, these terror groups have no choice but to portray an image of success. And of course, if you follow the Palestinian media in Gaza, you hear amazing success stories and how they beat the Zionist enemy and so on and so forth. If you talk to people in Gaza, which unfortunately don't have an independent voice because of the current situation, but if you have a conversation with someone in Gaza who will not be identified by his real name, they will tell you that they know what the Palestinian Islamic Jihad is all about, and the fact that they're taking Gaza down, they're the ones paying the price at the end of the day. When Gaza today has 2 hours of electricity per day, I can assure you that Hamas militants and Palestinian Islamic Jihad militants have electricity 24 hours a day, not 2 hours a day. So at the end of the day, there is a big difference in the public statements and the reality on the ground.
Avital, thank you. I'm looking at the clock and I'm thinking that we're probably out of time. Daniel, thank you for setting this up. And Avital, thank you again for leading us through this very complicated and very urgent situation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you to our global audience for joining us today. If you want to take action, join AJC in urging members of Congress to reaffirm their support for Israel. You can go to ajc.org/Israel Alliance. Again, that's ajc.org/Israel Alliance. Thank you, everyone, and have a great week. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.